Hi, everybody. I wanted to take a few moments to discuss what I was going to talk about in lecture yesterday. I appreciate everybody being patient with my last minute change of plans. I had a bit of an accident out in the yard when I was trying to secure things. We had that very windy day the other day and ended up hurting my ankle. And fortunately, it's just sprained, so it's not too bad, but it was um, putting me. I had to go tend to it yesterday. So anyway, I apologize for the delay, and I thought about it, and often during our lectures or during our class times, I'm sharing maps and my thoughts on them, and there's usually some time for some feedback, but often I feel like I'm just talking to my computer anyway. Um, so this hopefully will kind of address my thoughts about some of the labs and some of the work that I saw, and some like positive feedback, and then some kind of like minor things to keep in mind for future labs and for future mapping projects going forward. And then I will finish writing up the next lab, which is pretty straightforward. It's in Photoshop, and I had a bit of trouble with the extension in Photoshop. Something that has to do with Mac, which I will go over in the video about how to. Basically, you have to use a Photoshop legacy mode because of a. I don't even know what it is, honestly. It's some sort of update, and Photoshop did not update it the same way as the extension, and so you have to kind of revert back in a. It's a one button solution, so not a big deal. But I'll go with that. I'll finish writing those instructions this afternoon, and I will post them and send out a message saying that I posted them. Then I'll probably get to the instructional video about that tomorrow. And it's a pretty straightforward lab, so it should only take you, I don't know, an hour to do so. So it's not like a huge heavy lift. It's just kind of like an expansion of the Photoshop operations using your own data and kind of exploring some different options on your own a bit more. So anyway, so going to this environmental justice lab, one of the things I wanted to bring out was some of these relationships between historical policy and historical um, process, right? In terms of the neighborhoods that have been redlined historically, um, along with present day demographic distribution data and present day um, medical data or some sort of environmental health indicating data, right? And this gives us a sense of kind of those spatial correlations that exist between the past and between um, kind of institutional process and policy, and how that manifests in the spatial distribution and the geographic spaces of the city that we see on a daily basis. Um, so I think it's a really interesting exercise to allow us to think about uh, how the city is like shaped and how the city is created with this kind of uneven distribution kind of built into it, and that's a function of capitalism and a function of uh, the structure of our society. So, here's a really interesting example from one of the maps that I liked from Austin, Texas. Um, and you can see like there's a stark dividing line. This is Interstate 36. I'm not familiar with Austin personally, but I thought this was really interesting. That there is such a stark divide in just this highway that goes down, and on the right side of the highway, as this map notes, or on the east side, right, we have a higher proportion of black citizens, right, and we also see it doesn't really correlate with the red line information as much, right, and it's got a little bit more sparse, and that could just be having to do with this development of Austin. But there's definitely like a correlation between these high instances of census blocks with people that are uninsured, right, and that proportion of people within the community that are black, right, and then there's a stark kind of geographic divider between those two. And this is a great example of kind of the concept of uneven development, right? And there's always these pretty strong kind of dividing lines and borders that exist within cities, and it's like, south of this, it's like one type of city. The north of this, it's a different type of city, and we typically see that, with processes of gentrification, there will be almost like it's pieces of the city are dissected away, and that usually exists along transportation corridors or rivers or highways or things like that. So this is a great example of kind of illustrating that point, how a highway can be a dividing line in a city, right? That kind of it's kind of where the term "the other side of the tracks" comes from in a lot of ways, or the wrong side of the tracks, I guess. Um, yeah, so a great example here. It reminds me of a kind of those familiar with Chicago has a very similar type of situation. South of 60th Street, right, it's like completely changes the composition of the city. Whereas you go north of 60th, then it's much more affluent and kind of like uh, gentrified and modern, I guess, in a sense. So anyway, great job on this map. Really appreciate that. If we turn to the next one, in San Francisco, right here we see a much higher kind of correlation between that historical redlining data and the instances of communities with asthma and that relationship between communities with black citizens. So, another interesting example, and you kind of think about it, I know San Francisco a little bit better, and you start to think about some of these red line neighborhoods like this that don't show that same pattern, and you start to think, what's like different about those particular neighborhoods? Has there been more gentrification that's changed the demographic nature of that particular neighborhood, where a historically red line neighborhood is now, I think, this like a fluent gentrified space, right? And I think there's definitely some of that in San Francisco for sure. But if you look down here, in the south part of the peninsula, you definitely see that high spatial correlation, that high visual correlation between these variables. One thing I will note, so I really like this map. I like how the kind of text wrap with the text going around the island. That's a nice touch. And the scale bar, and it kind of all fits in. Sometimes you have to utilize the geography of the city and kind of fit your text and title and legend and stuff like that kind of in those blank spaces. This is a really good example of that. One thing I would caution against, two things I would caution against. One is that you have your colors for your two different quantitative variables, right? Your graduated symbols here and your choropleth symbols here are fairly similar. You can certainly tell the difference, but that's something you might want to have a little bit more kind of distinction on. You don't want your map to be kind of this like rainbow collage of things necessarily. And I think this has a nice tone, having the kind of purple gradient, or the purple sizes with the blue gradient. But it might be worth playing with that a little bit more. I would maybe keep the polygon gradient the same, and maybe try to go with something a little bit different than purple for the population data. But that's like a nitpicky thing, and color is always just such like a personal aesthetic choice that it's hard to say what would fit with the tone of the rest of the map. So it might be worth something exploring. It might be you run through a bunch of different options and it kind of circles back and lands exactly at the spot. The other thing that you definitely need, though, is when you have a legend like this, you need to have some sort of indication of what these set of symbols are and what these set of symbols are. Right? There needs to be some sort of title or like subheading within the legend. Like I said before, I don't really like boxes that sequester the legend out. Oftentimes, I think this is a nice example of like integrating the legend into the map, but you definitely just need like 2 or 3 labels here to like kind of clarify that a little bit. All right, the next map. This one, I think, again, of San Francisco, and this kind of cuts off a portion of the city, which shows, this area much more clearly, which I like. I really like the texture and kind of the background that's associated with this. Has a nice kind of historical feel to it, which I think is super cool, with the green and the red and the tan. Um, so yeah, I think this is a great looking map in a lot of ways, and I like the kind of like rounded uh, title box, right? That gives it definitely that historical feel again, for sure. So great job on the aesthetics. A couple things that I would note. One is that you know you can tell from the map that this part of the peninsula here is of kind of the most dominance or the most of visual display, but your legend kind of sits on top of a bunch of the data, right? So you have a bunch more data underneath your legend that's kind of obscured by this box that's sitting here. So you might want to clarify if that's the case and you're intentionally kind of blocking, this part of San Francisco's data out. Maybe your map should be titled uh, East or whatever. Your map should be titled to indicate that it's not just all of San Francisco that you're talking about here, but rather a portion, right? Like East Bay, or not East Bay, East San Francisco or Southeast, or whatever kind of I think that's my bearing. But whatever kind of like this set of data that's the most kind of prevalent, that's not being obscured out by your legend, perhaps the title should reflect that as opposed to saying all of San Francisco, then blocking out a bunch of the data. The other thing that I noticed here in the legend is you have like these conflicting, or these, oh, never mind. Actually, I just saw the greater than symbol. So, never mind. Yeah, so this is a good example of what to do, right? Is we have 0 to 0.12%. The next one is be greater than 12% to 37%, greater than 37% to 72%. Now, a lot of the times I see legends that say like 0 to 12%, and then the next line will say 12% to 37%, etc. And I'm not exactly sure what's going on with this largest one, 0.72 to 59. Just because this should be a percentage. Um, and I guess same here too. If it says percentage here, then you can put it as percentage instead of a decimal. Whereas here you say percentage, and it is a percentage and not a decimal. So just a little bit to clean up with the legend. The map looks great. The legend, maybe not so much, but that's okay. That's sometimes the legend feels tacked on, and in this case it does. And it's kind of one of the reasons I don't like having a box that kind of sits on top of the data like this that sequesters off the legend away from the map is that the map's so kind of engaging and aesthetically pleasing, and then having this kind of square box sitting on top of it kind of takes away from that feel that you get with the rest of the map. So great job overall. One caveat being the legend is has some limitations. All right, and then one other map that I wanted to show you that I think illustrates a good example of normalizing your data. So here is mapping healthcare inequalities of Hispanic residents in San Diego. And so, even though the redlining data is not necessarily directly correlated with the ability of Hispanic residents to get loans in the 1950s, often that kind of sets the condition of the redlining practices of the past, sets the condition of what the neighborhood composition is like, or the neighborhood economic status is like, and then which creates spaces that immigrant communities typically fill later in historical processes. And I'm not super familiar with San Diego, but that's kind of like the process that often happens in a lot of cities. If you look at New York or Atlanta or like Charlotte or cities like that, then that has, or DC, for example, that process is exhibited. And I have a sense it's probably the same here. In terms of that, like historical redlining information with present day Hispanic or Asian communities. Um, there's a bug instance, I think, a spider incident. Chicken incident. Anyway, so what are we doing here? Oh, so the main thing I wanted to illustrate with this map, however, is that you can see from this representation that a lot of the Hispanic population variables are the same, right? And when I first saw this map submitted, I noticed that. Let me zoom in a little bit. You can see is that the Hispanic population is this raw number, right? It's like instead of being the percentage of that population, it is the total. So it has not been normalized. And so what happens when you do that is you end up getting the you end up getting a lot of the data that kind of looks the same often, right? And it's not very indicative of the actual phenomena going on, but rather it's indicative of like what the underlying population totals are. Um, Whereas if you go to the next map and you normalize the data and you transfer it to a percentage, which is what this data has been, even though the legend has not been updated to indicate that, then you're getting a rate, right, or a percentage of the total for each neighborhood that indicates what that population composition is in compare. And so it allows you to compare across areas, and like that comparison is not dictated as much by the underlying data, but rather it's indicative of the relationship between that demographic variable and then the total population. So you always want to normalize data, and that's going to give you a much better representation, right, of what the phenomena is that you're mapping, especially when you're talking about human population data, right? Because the way that we settle across geographic spaces has a lot of variability and a lot of kind of structural fidelity, I guess, right? Like the infrastructure of the city is built, and then humans kind of like fill that in a certain way. So when you have a map like this, that is more indicative of kind of the structure of the city, the residential structure of the city, but doesn't really show you kind of that rate of change as compared to one demographic compared to other demographic groups or compared to the whole. So always normalize your data is my point, and you can see visually like how that changes the composition of the map, for sure. So I think that's all I have for this particular map or this particular lab. I enjoyed looking at the different projects. It allowed me to get a deeper sense of the kind of information that you guys were working with, and the way that you're kind of viewing this relationship between historical process and demographic and environmental health at various cities and at various scales across the country. And it was really cool to see people mapping Portland and San Diego and Atlanta and Boston and various cities. And we see like a similar relationship in so many places that it is indicative of process, right? And not indicative of individual geographies. And that's what we're always searching for when we're, as geographers, right? We're trying to see like what are these like patterns and what are these structures that kind of present themselves and manifest themselves in the environment in certain ways. So great job with this project in general, this lab in general, and hopefully it helped those of you that are doing research or interested in kind of this type of spatial justice, environmental justice type of framework to think about how you can use the different data to show that relationship across different geographic scales. So with that, I will stop the video, and like I said, I'll have the instructions for the next lab up shortly, and I'll have the video for that probably tomorrow. All right, I will talk to you later.